Jose, I hope all is well. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person today, but it is a great zechus to be able to continue learn with all of you virtually. A very special thank you to Mike Shabramson for working so hard to be able to allow me to be here, even though I'm not able to physically be here. All right, so we'll say, so today's daf is Nun Tes. We thank all of our sponsors. The sponsorship thank yous and dedications will be posted in the podcast description, as well as in the YouTube description as well. Today's daf is Nun Tes 59. We are starting from Nun Ches Samad Beis 58b. Some incredible Gemara today. Says the Gemara, Am Yisroel. We are about 10 lines up from the bottom. Hamagbiya yado achavero. If you raise your hand against someone, even if you don't actually strike them, you are called a Rasha. Shneimar. Pasuk says by Moshe Rabbeinu that Moshe Rabbeinu goes out to the field and he sees that the Mitzri is. This is Dasan and Abiram. That one Jew is about to strike another Jew. He says, Rasha lama sakeh re'acha. Now remember, neither party hit each other, but rather again he saw someone with an outstretched hand. He said, Rasha, why are you going to hit your fellow? So you see from here even the mere act of being ready to strike someone in and of itself labels someone as a Rasha. Gemara says, Lama hikisalo ne'mar. It doesn't say why did you hit your fellow. Ela lama sakeh. Why are you going to hit? Afa pi shelo hiko nikra Rasha. Even though again, Das and Aviram didn't actually strike each other, but nevertheless, since they are willing to strike each other, Moshe Rabbeinu called them a Rasha, or called the person who had his outstretched hand a Rasha. The Gemara says, Amar Ziri, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Nikra Chote. Ziri, Rabbi Chanina is the name of the Ziri, he's called the sinner. Shneimar, V'im lo lakachti b'chazako ksiv, v'ati chatas hana'arim gidola, by the sons of Eli Moed. Right? Rav Huna Amar tikatzetz yado. Rav Huna says, one who raises his hand to strike another Yid should have his hand cut off. Shneimar, uzroa rama tishaber. Rav Huna cuts yad, and in fact, Rav Huna once did this. There was an individual, Rashi points out over here, the consul bekach. There was an individual who was apparently habitually striking other people, and literally again, Rav Huna ordered that his hand be cut off. This was obviously a knas, a penalty of Beis Din. So I'll say a really profound Gemara about what it means to raise your hand against another Yid. Rav Elazar says, "Eno takana el kvura." Such a person, his behavior is so sinful that he has no atonement but burial, death. Shneimar v'ish zroa lo aretz. So again, it's fascinating to see in all of these cases is that here there's such profound culpability and liability, even though one did not actually commit an avera, which is actually quite striking, no pun intended, but quite overwhelming, because in general, when it comes to averas, so a person is not held responsible for machshava kimaisa. Person is not held responsible for their thoughts to commit an avera. Rather, we're only held responsible for our deeds. And yet here we see that when you're ready to strike someone, even just the mere act of lifting your hand against another Yid, by definition results in incredible culpability. So what's the pshat? So the Lubavitcher Rebbe says something very beautifully. Actually, the Lubavitcher Rebbe is commenting on that episode of Das and Aviram that the pasuk quoted, Rasha lama seges re'echa. The Rebbe says that every part of the body has a divinely ordained mission. And the avodah of the hands, the Rebbe says, is to be able to give to the other. When a person takes the hand that is supposed to be used to give, and instead Chas V'Shalom uses it to strike, it's like a misappropriation of divine resources. You're taking something that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave you, and it's almost like you're embezzling it. You're taking it, and you're repurposing it in the most terrible way. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me a hand to give, and now I'm using that hand to literally, again, be ready to say, even if you don't actually do it, just the act of raising your hand and being ready to use that divinely ordained resource that is supposed to be designated for giving, and instead I'm going to use it for hitting, Kadosh Baruch Hu says for such an act like that, there's no forgiveness. And it's such a profound yisod. The Rebbe's idea is a profound yisod, because the idea, if you think about it, everything we have in life is given to us by Kadosh Baruch Hu. It's a divine resource. And everything we have in this world, Kadosh Baruch Hu wants us to use for some bigger or higher or better or holier purpose. And when we don't, right, when we fail to use either our material assets, our personalistic assets, our emotional, cognitive, spiritual assets, when we fail to use them in a way that benefits the other, gives to the other, uplifts Klal Yisrael, it's a misappropriation of divine property. It's me'ilah, overwhelming yisod. Rabbi said, Gemara goes weiter. So, Avam Rabbi Elazar, lo nitna karka ela b'alei zros. This is interesting. Rabbi Elazar literally says, karka, real estate, is only good for people who are very strong. And Rashi points out over here, what does this mean? That when you get into real estate, again, there's always conflicts of ownership, and there's people grazing on your land, and people utilizing your resources. So real estate is not for the weak. Real estate is only for those who have the stomach for it and who are ready to fight. Interesting. Oved admoso yisbalachem. What does this mean ultimately? Again, that literally, person works his land, he will be satiated with bread. Im osa adam atzmo ke'eved la'adama yisbalachem. If a person makes himself like a servant to the earth, he will be satiated with bread. V'im lav. But if he doesn't make himself like an eved to the earth, lo yisbalachem, then ultimately again, he will not be satiated. Rashi says over ke'eved la'adama lasok batamid lecharisha v'ashkav nichosh. So again, quite literally, the Gemara is about agriculture over here. That farming, agriculture is one of those professions where you have to be fully committed. So if you make yourself an eved, you make yourself a slave, you make yourself a servant to your field, to your assets, to your real estate, you'll be successful. You don't make yourself an eved to it, you're not going to be successful. I will say, but what a profound Musar Haskell, not just about agriculture, but in life. I think what Chazal teaching us is, if you want to be successful in something in life, you have to make yourself an eved to that initiative. Meaning what? All too often in life, when we start something and either we just fall off or we don't succeed, it's very simple. It's because we lose interest. We move on to something else. We just lose our sense of commitment. And even if I don't totally fall off, I become like much more lackadaisical or laid back or just apathetic or just non-committal to it. If you want to be successful for anything in life, you have to make yourself an eved, a slave to that initiative and to that endeavor. If I'm a slave to it, remember, an eved doesn't really have a choice. An eved's got to work for the master. An eved wakes up one morning, oh, I'm so tired, I'm going to just sleep in today. No, you're an eved. You don't have that choice. An eved doesn't feel like doing this piece of work because he thinks it's beneath him. Sorry, you're an eved. You have no choice. An eved is someone who is all in. And Chazal are telling us, if you want to be successful in your life endeavors, you got to be an eved to it. You have to be a slave to it. Because if you're just kind of like episodically interested, if you're just perusing whatever initiative or endeavor you have in life, you're not going to be successful. And I will say, we see this in our learning, right? We know this from the daf. We know this from the daf, Chevra. It's always good, always easier to give a little bit of Musar when I'm not live. Again, person rolls into shir, person comes to shir, doesn't come to shir. Today I'm here, tomorrow I'm here, and again, it doesn't matter whether you're virtual, you're online, whatever your kvias is. Sometimes we're a little bit lackadaisical about it. Okay, so if I'm lackadaisical about it, don't be surprised if it doesn't feel fulfilling, and don't be surprised if it's not lifting your neshama up maila to the highest of the high, because you're only going to reap the benefits of the field. You're only going to reap the benefits of the endeavor if you make yourself an eved. And an eved is on time, and an eved is punctual, and an eved is committed, and it doesn't matter what else an eved has got going on, he's there because he is enslaved to whatever the particular initiative is. I know it sounds strange, but when you enslave yourself to your dreams, your goals, your aspirations, when you enslave yourself to your avoda in life, that's when and only when you reap the benefits of your avoda. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, good. Very interesting case here. Now, we normally translate this as who kept Shabbos. What it means is, Rashi points out, who didn't work. Rashi says, over Melachto, Yom Shalem. An Oved Kochavim who stops working for an entire day. The Rashi says, the Gemara says, it's Chayiv Misa. Liable to. Now, what does this mean? The idea over here is that an Oved Kochavim has an urgency that he also has to live with. Lest you think that living with a sense of urgency is only a Jewish thing. It's not true. Even an Akum has to live with a sense of urgency, and therefore it's interesting. Oved Kochavim sheshavas. So an Oved Kochavim who just takes it easy, takes a vacation in life. Incredible. All of humanity is mechuyev to be an eved to whatever initiative they've undertaken. Every person, Jew and non-Jew, is obligated to be enslaved to their goals, their dreams, and aspirations, because that's the only way in life you actually make things happen. As and we learned also again, anything they're warned about, that by definition becomes their liability for death penalty as well for non-compliance. Even lest you think that, this is only Shabbos, that the Gemara is saying a guy is not allowed to keep Shabbos, which is true by itself also. This is true even if they're not taking off Shabbos. This is just talking about the idea of living a lackadaisical, relaxed, laid-back life. That is not what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants from man in this world. It's not what he wants from Jews, and it's not even what he wants from non-Jews. He wants everyone to be plugged in. He wants everyone to be enslaved. He wants everyone to be operating on all cylinders. Incredible. So why not include this in Shem Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, that a Nochri is not allowed to quote unquote keep Shabbos. So the Gemara says, Kika chashiv shevi al tasa kumase lo chashiv. The Shem Mitzvahs B'nai Noach only include shevi al tasa, things you're not allowed to do. Doesn't include things that you have to do. Top of Nun Test 59a. That's not true. The obligation to establish a judicial system, that's a kumasei, that's a positive obligation. So the Gemara says, and it's included Shem Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Top of Nun Test 59a, second line. Kumasei v'shevi al tasanenu. The truth is, the obligation to go ahead and establish a judicial system is both a positive commandment, right? It's a positive commandment, and it's also a prohibition. In other words, that halacha l'maisa, what's the prohibition? That don't allow injustice to go ahead and occur within your boundaries. Okay? Rabbi Yochanan, is incredible. A non-Jew who learns Torah is chayiv misa. Why? Shneimar, Torah tziva lanu Moshe morasha. Morasha. Torah, Moshe commanded us Torah morasha. It is an inheritance. The Gemara says, lanu morasha v'lo lahem. It's an inheritance for us and not for them. It doesn't belong to the nations of the world. Therefore, if they learn it the Chai Misa. Now, why Chiyav Misa? V'lechashvei gabe sheva mitzvos. Now listen to this. So then why not include this and Shem Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, that a Ben Noach is not allowed to learn Torah? To which the Gemara says, Man damer morasha migzal kagazale. So interestingly enough, we're going to see that there are two ways to read this word. Torah tziva lanu Moshe, Morasha Kihilas Yaakov. So one opinion says Morasha, which means it's an inheritance to the Jewish people. See if you hold it's an inheritance. If a non-Jew learns it, he's taking it from us, and therefore it's theft. And theft is already included as one of the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach. Mandar Morasha Migzal Kagazile. Mandar Mi'urasa. The other opinion says it's not Morash Kihilas Yaakov, but rather Mi'urasa Kihilas Yaakov. We are wed to Torah. Klal Yisrael is wed to Torah. So therefore, again, if a non-Jew goes there and learns Torah, Dino Kinara Mu'urasa Beskila, it's like adultery. Like adultery, like Nara HaMu'urasa, which you can remember, Bnei Noach don't have Nara HaMu'urasa, and therefore, again, they're judged according to Yisrael standards, and therefore they get Skila. So first of all, this happens halachically. This is an interesting Gemara, because in general, there's a lot of discussion about what does this apply to? Is this Torah Shebechsav? Is this the 5 books of the Chumash? Is it Torah Shebal Peh? So according to most opinions, this prohibition is not on Torah Shebechsav. Doesn't apply to Chumash, right? Chamisha Chumshei Torah. But rather, it's more a prohibition on Torah Shebal Peh, Mishnah, Gemara, things like that. Now, this happens to pose a very interesting question, because when people study for conversion, obviously they have to go ahead and learn Torah Shebal Peh as well. Okay, so we'll put this on our list for fascinating Daf Yomi topics to talk about at a different time, but just to put it on your radar. But I'll also mention, which is really quite amazing, is it tells you the beautiful relationship that we Klal Yisrael have with Torah. And it's a multifaceted relationship. On one hand, it's a Yerusha. It's an inheritance. Now, the interesting part about an inheritance is there's nothing per se you do to get an inheritance, right? The person has a rich parent or has a parent with assets, the parent dies, I get the inheritance. So on one hand, there's an element of Torah that's mine simply because it belonged to previous generations, and now it's passed down to me. I didn't do anything. I didn't earn anything. I just received it by dint of those who came before me. But then there's also Torah is a me'urasa. Me'urasa eris in marriage is a distinct and beautiful and harmonious union that is created by 2 people. So on the other hand, I have my own unique relationship with Torah. So on one hand, Torah is a Yerusha. I have it from my family before me, from generations before me, going back to Har Sinai. I didn't do anything. It's just been passed down to me. But then my job is to take the Yerusha and make it a Me'urasa. My job is to take the inheritance and make it my betrothed, and create a beautiful, loving, and passionate relationship with Torah. You know, it reminds me of the beautiful Belzer Rebbe I mentioned it many times. One of my favorite ideas. Pasuk says in Az Yashir that we just read last week. So last week, Zekeli va'anveu Elokei avi va'aram memeno. This is my God, and I'll make him great. Elokei avi, the God of my father, and I will exalt him. And the Belzer Rebbe says, you see from here that there are two relationships with Hashem. There's Elokei avi, the God of my father. But lest the person think that they could content themselves with a relationship with God that has been passed down from previous generations, it also says Zekeli. This is my God. So there's the God of my father, but now my job is to also create my own relationship. The Torah is a Yerusha, it's passed down, but my job is to take the Yerusha, the inheritance, and to make it my me'urasa, to make it my betrothed. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Meisvei, Hayrag Meir used to say, Minayin shafilu oved kochavim va'osek b'Torah, shuka kohen gadol. How do you know that if a kohen, right, that if an oved kochavim learns Torah, Akum learns Torah, that he's as great as a kohen gadol? Shneimar asher yasa osama adam v'chai bohem. So the pasuk says these are the words of the Torah that a person should perform and he should live by them. It doesn't say kohanim l'dim Yisrael lo nemar. It doesn't say kohanim l'dim Yisrael. Ella ha'adam. Adam is a generic term that applies to all human beings. Halamarata, what does that teach you? Shafilu ovdei kochavim va'osik b'Torah harika kohen gadol. That even if an akum, even if a Gentile goes in and learns Torah, he's mamish like a Kohen Gadol. Shabbos says, so this contradicts what we just said before. Before we just said that Akum is not allowed to learn Torah, and if he does, he's liable to death. And here we see he's mamish like a Kohen Gadol. So which one is it? Mara says, no, it's not a contradiction. Hasam b'sheva mitzvos didahu. So again, it is great for an Akum to learn Torah. When it comes to Sheva mitzvos. All right, a Ben Noach has to learn Torah that applies to him, has to learn about his 7 mitzvahs. And if he does, when he plumbs the depths and he understands it develops an appreciation, then mamish, he becomes like a Kohen Gadol. But he doesn't need to be learning about the rest of the mitzvahs that apply to Klal Yisrael, don't apply to him. For that's not his Yerusha, that's not his Ma'orasa, that belongs to us. Incredible. Rabbi Shmuel Silber, so remember again, we saw in the previous tapim that different opinions added different mitzvahs onto the Shem mitzvahs b'nei Noach. Rabbi Shmuel ben Gamliel said, Ben Noach also can't eat blood from a living creature, from a living animal. So when the pasuk says that you're not allowed to eat basar benafsho damalosochelu, you can't eat the meat when the life force is in it, that's a limb from a living animal. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel Omer af hadam min achai. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel says not only are you not allowed to eat iver min achai, but you also can't eat dam min achai. You also can't eat blood from a living animal. So the Gemara says, my time is Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel. What's Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel's logic? Kari be basar benafsho lo sochel, damo benafsho lo sochel. So Rabbi Chanina makes an interesting drush on the pasuk. The Torah says, ach basar benafsho, damo lo sochel. Rabbi Chanina understands there's two different prohibitions. There's basar benafsho, you can't eat meat from a living animal, and then there's damo benafsho, you can't eat blood from a living animal either. Quite amazing. Rabbanon will say, no, that's coming, Hudasa. That pasuk, that phrase is actually coming, that damo is actually coming to teach me that halacha l'maisa, you're allowed to eat the limb from shratzim, creepy crawly things. You could pull off a limb, okay, if you want to. You could pull off a limb from Ben Noach, you could pull off a limb from shratzim and could eat that. Okay, kiyotzi b'davar, similarly again, ata omer, rak chazak l'viltiach chol adam, ki adam hu hanefesh. Pasuk says, be strong and do not eat blood, because the blood is the life force of the animal. So the Gemara darshans, rak chazak leveltiach al adam ze iver min achai. There first, so when it says, don't eat the blood, that's iver min achai. Ki adam hu hanefesh zed dam min achai. So the Gemara is just quoting another brayso that supports this idea of Chanina Gamliel, that not only is there a prohibition to eat iver min achai, a limb from a living animal, but you also can't eat dam min achai. The Rabbanon will say, hahu ledam hakaza shana shama yotze bohu da'asa. That's coming to prohibit dafka the dam hakaza, the lifeblood. You're not allowed to eat the lifeblood, but the other that are the blood that spurts out when the animal is initially killed, but the other blood you're allowed to eat. All right. Lama li lemichtav libnei noach, lama li lemishnei b'sinai. So this is interesting. Now, if you'll notice, the Gemara pointed out over here that the prohibition of Ever Min Achai, of eating a limb from a living animal, is mentioned in Sefer Bereshis, right, by Adam Arishon, and it's also mentioned again in Chumash Devarim, after Har Sinai. So why does it have to be repeated? So this is incredible. Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina, this is actually very important. Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina said the following rule. Listen to how fascinating this is. Whenever you have a mitzvah that was stated in the Torah, and then was repeated at Har Sinai. Now, when it says repeated at Har Sinai, what it means is it was said before Matan Torah and was repeated again in the Torah after Sinaitic revelation. And again, I will say, how incredible is it? We're learning about, again, Matan Torah, Erev Shabbos, Parshas Yisro, Aseres Hadibros, incredible. So whenever you see something that was mentioned to Bnei Noach before Matan Torah, and then repeated again, after Matan Torah, Lezeh u'lezeh nemra. It applies both to Bnei Noach and to Jews. Libnei Noach v'lo nishnas b'Sinai. If something was only said before Matan Torah to Bnei Noach and wasn't repeated by Har Sinai or after Har Sinai, then liYisrael nemra v'lo libnei Noach. It only applies to Jews, doesn't apply to Bnei Noach. Va'anu ein lanu ela gid hanasha. The only example of this is gid hanasha. Right, the prohibition of gid hanasha was mentioned before Sinai, right? It was mentioned by the fight between Yaakov and the Malach, where the Malach went ahead, the Esarosh Esav, right? Esav's ministering angel fought with Yaakov the whole night, was unable to overtake him, but injured him in his thigh, and therefore the Torah says, Al Kain, therefore Klal Yisrael will not eat the gid hanasha. That prohibition is never repeated again in the Torah. So the Gemara says that's an example of something that was mentioned before Matan Torah, not repeated again after Matan Torah. That only applies to Klal Yisrael and not to Bnei Noach. Valib Rabbi Yehuda. And this is in accordance, right, Gid Hanasha in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda. So Rashi has a whole arichos over here. Right, it's interesting. So there's an interesting machlokes in general about whether or not Gid Hanasha was stated after Matan Torah or not. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that halach l'maaseh it wasn't stated. It was only stated by Yaakov Avinu. Wasn't stated again. The other opinion actually holds, interestingly enough, and they say no. Gid Hanasha was actually a prohibition given to Klal Yisrael at Har Sinai. It's just that when Moshe Rabbeinu was compiling the Torah with his Ruach Kodesh Makadosh Baruch Hu, so he put the prohibition of Gid Hanasha back by the story of Yaakov Avinu, but it wasn't given there. It was actually given later on, but only put back retrospectively, placed in the story. So an interesting machlokes. Okay, Omer Mar, so listen to this. So let's go through this principle. So now, what did Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina say? Any mitzvah that was said before Matan Torah and was then repeated again after Matan Torah applies to both Jews and non-Jews alike. So Gemara says, why? Adarabba, midinishnis b'Sinai liYisrael nemra v'lo libnei Noach. I would say just the opposite. From the fact that it was said before Har Sinai and then said again at Har Sinai, doesn't that mean that it's dafka for Yidden, it's dafka for Jews, and not for Bnei Noach? To which the Gemara says, no, midasni avodos kochavim b'Sinai, v'ashkechan da'anash ovdei kochavim iluya, u'ilavash mamina lezeh u'lezeh nemra. No, so here's the difference, because we find it by idolatry, right? Idolatry was mentioned before Har Sinai, as we saw already before, right? It was repeated again, actually, as part of Aseres Hadibros. Lo yeh lecha Elohim achirim. This week's parsha can't have any other gods, and we know that avodah zarah applies to Jews and non-Jews. So that gives rise to the principle that any mitzvah that was recited before Matan Torah and then repeated again at Matan Torah applies to Jew and non-Jew alike. Okay, let's go weiter. Still analyzing the principle. Similarly, again, if you have a mitzvah that was said to Bnei Noach before Matan Torah, was not repeated at Har Sinai, that applies to Jews and not to non-Jews. The Gemara says, I don't understand. Adrabah, I could just say just the opposite. Right? So again, I should say just the opposite. The fact that it was given to Bnei Noach before Matan Torah and wasn't given again at Har Sinai, doesn't that indicate that it only applies to non-Jews and not to Jews? To which the Gemara says, no, I'll tell you why. Leka, the Gemara says, Leka medam to the Yisrael Shayla Ovei Kochavim Aser. Is there such a thing as something being mutter for Jews and usher for non-Jews? It doesn't make any sense. Anything that by definition is going to be usher for non-Jews, of course, is going to be usher for Jews as well. So the Gemara says, "V'lo, it's not true. V'hari yifas toar. What about yifas toar?" So remember again, we saw this before. An akum, right, or ben noach is not permitted in yifas toar. It's called gezel. It's called theft. Yet a Jew is permitted in the war bride yifas toar. Hasim mishum delab b'nei kibosh nino. That's different. Yifas toar is a function of a conquering army. The Torah's definition of a conquering army is a Klal Yisrael army. It's not a Ben Noach army. Incredible. What about theft of less than a pruta? Remember again, by Yisrael, that's not theft. By a Ben Noach it is. That which Gemara says again, Hasam Mishum de la B'nei Mechila. That's because Jews are capable of forgiveness. B'nei Noach are not. And therefore, again, a Yid could be Mochel on Pachos Mishava Pruta, but a Ben Noach can't. So we spoke about this before a couple of days ago. Ayin Sham, incredible Yisod about what it means to be a Yid. What it means to be a Yid is the ability to forgive. And where there is forgiveness, ultimately, again, there's mechila. And where there is mechila, there is the ability to move forward. Otherwise, without the ability to forgive, without the ability to be mochel, every single thing in life becomes a stinging rebuke, a stinging slight, difficulty, and impossible to forge beautiful and meaningful and lasting relationships. Incredible. Sani mitzvah that was said to Bnei Noach and was repeated Har Sinai applies to both Jews and non-Jews. Amud Beis, I v'hari Mila. What about Bris Mila? What about Bris Mila? Shneimar lebnei Noach tesiv va'atas brisi tishmar. So remember again. So Hashem says to Avram Avinu, this was before Matan Torah, keep the covenant of my bris. The Nishnas B'Sinai was repeated by Har Sinai. What does it say by Har Sinai? Ubayom Hashmini Mal B'Srael, so Parshas Tazria. So it was repeated. And the Gemara says, Nemra, V'lo Libnei Noach. Yeah, we know the mitzvah of Mila doesn't apply by Bnei Noach, so it doesn't go with the principle. The principle says anything said, right? Anything said ultimately again by Har Sinai, Libnei Noach, and ultimately again repeated Har Sinai applies to both. But Mila was said before Har Sinai, said again at Har Sinai, only applies to Yidden, doesn't apply to Bnei Noach. To which the Gemara says, "Hahu lemishnei Shabbos hudasa." No. The repetition actually of the mitzvah of Mila and Parshas Tazria is to add a very important detail, namely the bayom afilu b'Shabbos, to teach us that when the 8th day falls out on Shabbos, you do Mila on Shabbos. This is important because I might have thought Mila requires the drawing of blood. Drawing of blood is Asr on Shabbos under the Av Malach of Shchita. So I might have thought that you can't do Mila on Shabbos. Kamash Malon, the additional mention of Mila, Bayom Hashmini, Afilu b'Shabbos, even on Shabbos. So actually the repetition is not coming to include anyone, right? It applies to Yidden. The repetition is coming to teach you a new halacha. I have already perivarivya. What about perivarivya? Mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply. Propagation. Shenemar v'libnei Noach. Right? On one hand, it says to Bnei Noach, v'chsev va'atem peru uravu. Right? Remember again, Adam is given perivarivya. Noach is given perivarivya. V'nishnas b'Sinai. It was said again by Har Sinai. Where was it said by Har Sinai? Lech emor lahem shuvu lachem la'oha lechem. Kadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu, go tell the people to go back to their tents. So this is incredible. Remember again, this is again all this week's parasha. Moshe Rabbeinu tells Klal Yisrael, "Kidashtem hayom u'machar." You have to prepare yourselves, and part of their preparation was husbands and wives separated from intimacy. After Kabbalah Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael, "Go back to your tents." And Rashi understands going back to your tent is a euphemism for resumption of an intimate relationship with one spouse. So Moshe Rabbeinu was essentially being mitzvah, was commanding them again regarding perivarivya. So it was said before Matan Torah, said again at Matan Torah. So the Gemara says, Libnei Yisrael namra v'lo Libnei Noach. So again, ultimately, that was said for Klal Yisrael, not for Bnei Noach. To which the Gemara says, "Hahu l'chol davar shebeminyan tzarich minyan acher la'atir." You're right. That's actually coming to teach us a separate halacha. Right. The repetition there is not to go ahead and make it binding on Bnei Noach. The repetition, interestingly enough, is there in order to teach us another principle, namely that something, a halacha that is legislated by one group, can only be repealed by a group of the same number. By another group of the same number and wisdom, or of greater number and wisdom. So v'haraya Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Kadosh Baruch Hu told them v'kidashtem, and therefore again Kadosh Baruch Hu tells them lechem or lehem, go tell the people. The same Kadosh Baruch Hu told us to separate was the same Hashem who told us to go back to our tents. Okay, Ihachi kol chad v'chad nami nema mishum milsa isni. I'm sorry, kol chad v'chad nema mishum milsa isni. So you can say that about everything. Every time a halacha was repeated, there is some new element which is introduced. Hakikama, this is what it means to say. Ashara mihadar umisna ba lamali. Ultimately, again, why was there a need to repeat the repercussions or the punishment for these particular infractions? Ve'ein lanu ella git hanosha bilvad. So va'alibad Rabbi Yehuda, and ultimately, again, all we have is the case of Gid Hanosha, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, as we said before, Rabbi Yehuda's understanding of Gid Hanosha, that it was only stated once before Matan Torah. Hani Nami Lo Isni, ultimately again, but Mila and Perivarivya also weren't repeated, right? The Gemara says, Hani istin l'shemilsa ba'alma. These ultimately, again, were repeated, again, as we mentioned before, because they introduced some new halacha. Ha lo isni klal. But gid hanosha, at least wasn't explicitly restated at all. Ibay, so another possibility is, Mila meikar the Avram hu dekama asher rachmana. In reality, perhaps we could say that, at least by bris Milah, the obligation of Mila was not given to Bnei Noach. It was given to Avram Avinu. It was given to Avram, who dekama asher rachmana. V'ata is brisi tishmar. V'ata v'zaracha acharecha l'dorasam. Ata v'zarecha in shachrin alone. Second wide line. The mitzvah is given to Avram and his offspring, but just to Avram and his offspring, not to anyone else. Okay, well, if it's to Avram and his offspring, so why shouldn't the sons of Yishmael, right? Yishmael is also a son of Avram Avinu. Why shouldn't he be chayiv in Milah? The which the Gemara says, Ki Yitzchak yikar l'chazara. Because Kadosh Baruch Hu says, Yitzchak is the defined offspring of Avram Avinu. If that's the case, fine. So let it be through Yitzchak. But Bnei Esav l'chayvu, let it be Esav then also. In other words, if you want to say fine, it's mitzvah to Avram. And from Avram, it goes to Yitzchak because Yitzchak is the real... Yitzchak is the inheritor of Avram Avinu. That's fine. Then let it go to Yitzchak's kids, Yaakov and Esav. Why not Esav? To which the Gemara says, Be Yitzchak, v'lo kol Yitzchak. Avram, you will live on within Yitzchak, but not through all of Yitzchak. Meaning, one of Yitzchak's sons will perpetuate your legacy, but not all of Yitzchak's sons. Only Yaakov and not Esav. Therefore, it's only, again, the thread through Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Therefore, to us, that Mila applies, but not to any of Avram Avinu's other offspring. If that's the case, B'nei Keturah, right? At the end of Parashas Chayei Sarah, so Avram Avinu remarries. And right, Vayikach Isha Shma Keturah, V'atei La Zimran, Ves Yakshan, Ves Medan, Ves Midyan. They have a whole bunch of kids. So maybe the B'nei Keturah shouldn't be chayiv in Milah. So Mars V'ham Rabbi Yossi, Avin Ritim Rabbi Yossi B'chanina, as Brisi Hefer, L'Rabos B'nei Keturah. So ultimately, again, B'nei Keturah are included. Okay. So interestingly enough, it might be only Yitzchak and one of Yitzchak's sons, but apparently there may have been other people, at least initially, part of the Abrahamic obligation of Bris Milah. Incredible. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Well, says beautiful Gemara. Adam Rishon lo huter lo basar la'achila. Fascinating Gemara. Adam Rishon was not permitted to eat meat. Adam Rishon was a vegetarian. He was not permitted to go ahead and eat meat. T'chsiv lachem yeh la'achla or l'chol chayas hasadeh. So the pasuk says when Hashem created the vegetation, Hashem says to Adam, right? I've given you all the asib, all the vegetation. It's for you, lachem yeh la'achla, to you, for you, and for all of the animals. So you and the animals can eat the vegetation, but you can't eat the animals. So Adam Rishon was not allowed to eat meat. He was a vegetarian. Which, by the way, if you think about it, so Rav Kook has pieces on this, the Nazir Yerushalayim has pieces on this concept that in like some utopian way, man is not consuming animals for his own consumption. That man uses whatever organically grows on the earth for his own consumption, but he doesn't take life. He doesn't take life in order to go ahead and sustain his own. There's a purity in that was later on corrupted. Obviously, then when Noach comes along after the flood, so after the flood, meat becomes permitted. Shenemar ki yerek esev nasati lachem es kol. So when I thought that once Noach is allowed to eat meat, there's no more prohibition of Ever Min HaChai either. Talmud Lomar, Ach Basar B'nafsho Damo Lo Sochilu. Okay, Yachol Af L'Shratzim. So you might have thought that again, maybe Ever Min HaChai applies to Shratzim also. Talmud Lomar, Ach. Okay, Shratzim, as we saw this on Lamed Aleph, Shratzim are excluded from Ever Ben Chaim. Umay Talmuda, so what's the limud? Am Rav Huna, Damo. Misha Damo Chalak Psaro. Ever Ben Chaim only applies to someone or to something that has a distinction between its flesh and its blood. Yatsu Shratzim Shem Daman Uvechalak Psaro. So you can see it there, we've seen like a sheretz, and an animal, right? An animal has like flesh, and then there's blood and other stuff behind it. The sheretz is all like just one mush, right? It's all one thing. Therefore, there's no Evra Min HaChai when it comes to Shratzim. Meisvei Uredu B'degas Hayam. So the pasuk says so again. So now the Gemara is understanding this idea that Adam HaRishon was not allowed to eat meat. And Bepashtos, if Adam HaRishon was not allowed to eat meat, it probably means that he wasn't allowed to eat fish or fowl either. He wasn't allowed to kill animals for his own consumption. So the Gemara says, so Hashem creates Adam, he says to Adam, you're going to rule over the fish of the sea. Now, what does that mean to rule over the fish of the sea? My love la'achila, doesn't that mean for consumption? Lo l'malacha, it means no, you could use the fish to work for you. So the Gemara says, what are you going to use fish to work for you? What does that mean? How can you put fish to work? In kidirachba, like Rachba said, the boy Rachba, hinig be'iza v'shibuta. If you pull your plow with a goat and a shibuta fish, right? So you put the yoke, you have the shibuta fish, in the water, the goat on land, and you have them both pulling the plow forward. Is that called kilayim? Is that called a forbidden mixture? So you could put a fish to work also. But so Adam doesn't have the right to eat fish, but he has the right to utilize the fish for his service to work for him. So the Gemara says, Tashma, uba'ofa shamayim, you should rule over the birds of the sky. My lav la'achila, doesn't that mean he could eat the birds? Lo l'malacha. No, he could use the birds for work. So Gemara says, "Ofos b'nei malacha." I don't understand. You could use birds for work. In kidebai Rabbi barafuna dash ba'avzin v'tarnagolin. The Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Mai says interesting again, without getting into all technicalities over here. So again, halacha might say if you threshed with geese or with chickens, according to Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, what is the halacha? So again, this has to do with Rashi points out over here that Rabbi Yosef Yehuda holds that there is a special permit for workers to eat while they're working the field. So but in order for that to happen, the worker has to be working both with his feet and his hands at the same time. So when an animal is using all fours, so then he's also considered to be working with everything. He's allowed to eat while he's working. The shaila is, if let's say you thresh with geese or with chicken, so there's only 2 feet. So is that called that the whole animal is at work? Therefore, the animal should be permitted to eat? Or no, the whole animal is not at work. Okay, so like I said, the details are not as important for the discussion. What's more important for the discussion is it's illustrating how you could put geese and you could put chickens, fowl, birds, to work. Okay? Tashma, ubechol chai haromeses ala aretz. Right? And you will rule over all the animals that wander the earth. So the Gemara says, Hahu la'asuye nachash hu da'asa. This comes to include that man originally was supposed to have dominion even over the snake. This sign, an incredible Gemara. Rabbi Shimon Menashe Omer, Chaval al shamish kala sha'avim mina olam. Woe to man, because as a result of the sin of the tree, of the Eitz Hadas, of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that Adam wasn't supposed to eat from, therefore Adam was punished, Chava was punished, and the Nachash, the snake, was punished. Man lost out on a tremendous attendant. The snake was supposed to be the right hand of man, right? The snake was supposed to be someone who enabled man to accomplish much, and man lost out on it as a result of the sin. So Gemara says, Il Mali known as Kalal Nachash, because had the Nachash not because remember again, the Chazal tell us originally the Nachash had feet, had arms, was able to speak, stood upright. The Nachash was a highly evolved, highly developed animal who was supposed to be their tailmaster. Had Adam not sinned, what would have happened? So every person called every Yid, every Jew would have 2 snakes, 2 good snakes. One snake you would send north, one snake you would send south. Lahavilo sand levonim tovim va'avanim tovos umargolios. And snakes apparently, this is before they slither, but they knew how to dig, they knew how to find stuff. So they would mine out all the most beautiful, precious stones and gems. And again, you send them out to do their thing, and they come and they bring it back to you. Not only that, you could have attached something underneath the tail of the snake, and it could schlep stuff. It could take dirt out. It could take dirt out, ultimately, again, to your garden or to your ruin. The Gemara says, so I'll just point out something amazing, that, the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world is he created the world to serve us. Right? He created the world to serve man. The whole avoda of the earth, the whole avoda of the animal kingdom, the whole avoda of vegetation, of everything, is to serve man. Man is the crown jewel of creation. But man only merits to be served by the rest of creation when he occupies his exalted place in we'll call it in the spectrum of creation, in the ladder of creation. But when man abdicates his personalistic greatness, so he abdicates that right to be served by creation, that's when the earth turns on him. That's why, after Adam HaRishon sinned, What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu tell Avram Avinu? He says, Avram, Adam, you're going to work the land. The coats v'dar dar titzmach. You're going to plow the field, and it's going to sprout forth thorns and thistles. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means the world is not going to cooperate with you. When man doesn't do what he is supposed to do, the earth doesn't cooperate. The animals don't cooperate. The sun and the moon, the world doesn't cooperate. It's an incredible, incredible thing. When I do what I'm supposed to do, when we do what we're supposed to do, so then okay, universe, serve man because man is serving me. Man is performing his purpose, serving me, and therefore, world, you do your purpose by serving man. But when we abdicate our sacred duty, not only are we shirking our own personal responsibilities, but we're disrupting the natural order of things. Suddenly the animals are going to do their own thing, and the earth is going to do its own thing, and all these things that were created to serve me are now again focusing on other things, and even worse, sometimes even acting and working against me. Overwhelmingly amazing. So Meisvei, the Gemara is the Kasha, Hay Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema Omer, Adam Arishon Meisav began Eden, Haya, Vahayu Malachi Ashar Solim Babas from Stan Lo Yad. This is such a beautiful and incredible Gemara. Adam Arishon was sitting in Gan Eden. He was sitting in Gan Eden. And what happened? And the Malachi Asharis, the angels, were serving him and taking care of him. And they were roasting him meat. And they were pouring him, Sana literally means they were sifting or straining wine for him. They were pouring him beautiful wine. So can you imagine that? Can you imagine this? Adam Arishon is sitting in Gan Eden. It's Erev Shabbos, a little Toamel, right? He's sitting there. They're making a barbecue for him, a meat board. It's a raya for a meat board by Toamel. So they're going ahead and they're making him mamish, a meat board. They're roasting for a meat. They're pouring him delicious wine from Eretz Yisrael, pouring him delicious wine. The Nachash sees it, hits its bo Nachash. The Rabbi Chvodo saw the cover that was being given to Adam Arishon, beniskanable. And the Nachash became jealous. And I will say, it was that jealousy that led to this entire story. You see, in life, if you want to know why did the first sin occur? Because the Nachash wasn't happy with what he had. He wanted what someone else had. So I will say, the Rebbe Shalom gives us each what it is that we're supposed to have. When we look at someone else who has more or has something different and we're jealous of them, we no longer have the ability to be content with what we have. And that lack of contentment, it stirs all kinds of things and moves all kinds of things in a wrong direction. The Nachash was just jealous of the cover that Adam Arishon got. And look what happened. When you spend your life looking at what everyone else has, competing with everyone else, wanting what everyone else has, number one, you're never happy with what you have, and it turns you into the kind of person you don't want to become. But the point of why is Gemara bringing this up? Adam Arishon is eating meat. He's eating meat. We just before Adam Arishon didn't eat meat. Hasan bebasa yor min hashamayim. The Gemara says, different, that meat came from the heavens. I guess it's like the first Impossible Burger, right? That wasn't meat that came from an animal. That was meat that came from Shamayim. The Rebbe Shalom prepared the meat board. So what is that? I don't know. Is it fleshix? Is it? I don't know what it is. It's Impossible Burger. So it was the first. So therefore, it wasn't. Adam Rishon didn't slaughter anything for that meat. Kadosh Baruch Hu brought it down from Shamayim. The Gemara says, "Whoa, mi'ika basar yor min hashamayim? Is there such a thing like that as meat that falls from the heavens? Does that actually happen? In Kiyad Rabbi Shimon Chalafta, yeah, that does happen. What happened? One time, Rabbi Shimon Chalafta, Havaka Azl Ba'archa, was traveling on the way. Pagu Ba'hanach Aryusa, the Kava Kanami La'ape. Two lions came to him and they started roaring in his face. Amar. So Rabbi Shimon Chalafta says to them, Akfirim Shagin Lateref. The lion cubs are crying out for food. And what happened? Nachisu le tarti atmasa. Two slabs of meat, two pieces of meat fell, two sides of meat fell right in front of him. Chada achlua, one of them the lions ate. The chada shavkua, one they left behind. They were full from the first one. Aisi v'asla be midrasha. Ultimately, Rabbi Shimon Chalafta brought that last piece of meat to the beis medrash. Brought the past to the meat to the beis medrash. And he asked, Boy Allah, they asked him, I'm sorry, davar tameh huzeh or davar tar? So what is this? Is the meat, is it kosher or is it treif? Like, I guess maybe they wanted to have a little bit. Is it kosher or is it treif? Rabbi Shimon Chalafta said, what are you talking about? There's no such thing as a davar tameh that comes from Shamayim. Both said, by the way, that what are you talking about? Meat fell from the heavens, and you're asking what the hashgacha is? Meat fell from the heaven, you're asking if it's kosher? You're asking if it's kosher or it's tameh? Nothing that is treif comes from Shamayim. Everything comes from Shamayim. is kosher, is tar. Rabbi say, but that phrase is so powerful. Ein davar tamei yored min hashamayim. Anything that comes from Shamayim, anything that comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is never tamei. It may hurt, it may be difficult. Any circumstance that comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is every circumstance in life, is never tamei. It may be overwhelming, it may be challenging, it may be difficult, it may be painful, but some way, somehow, it's for Kedusha and it's for Tara. Because ein davar tamei yored min hashamayim. Whatever circumstances the Ribono Shel Olam give us are never to bring us down, are never to generate tumah, but fakir, just the opposite, only to lift us up and to engender within us a sense of Kedusha and a sense of Tara. Incredible. Boy, last two lines. What happens if a donkey came down from a shamayim? Kadosh Baruch Hu went ahead and brought down a donkey from the heavens. So that's a donkey. It's a donkey. A donkey is a tamei animal, right? A treif animal. But it came down from shamayim. So what's Amar Le Yad Nala? So essentially, they asked this from Rabbi Zera, right? So Rabbi Zera asked this from Yavo. So Rabbi Yavo said to Rabbi Zera, Yad Nala. Essentially, he said, "You're a donkey." In other words, that was a I guess the way of saying that is not a good question, right? Yarnal, you're a crazy donkey. Rashi says tanin shota of sheshmo tana. Okay, he says not a donkey, but rather again like a crazy bird. You're a crazy bird. In other words, what's the matter with you? What kind of question is that? Ha'amrile ein davar tamei yored min hashamayim. It doesn't matter if Kadosh Baruch Hu creates a donkey, he creates the lev yasan, he creates a side of lox, a brisket. It doesn't make a difference, whatever it is. If it comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it is going to be Tarna. It's incredible. If it comes from Hashem, even if it looks treif, if it comes from Hashem, even if it looks bad, if it comes from Hashem, even if it looks terrible, always remember one thing. Ein davar tamei yored min hashamayim. If it comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's not tamei. If it comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's not bad. If it comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it is not unclean. It may be difficult, it may be painful, it may be challenging, but whatever comes from Hashem is only there to bring about Kedusha and Tara within our lives. So both saying, Shkoyach, what a tremendous week. Wishing everyone a good night of Shabbos and Shkoyach.